It's Europe's biggest street festival, a joyful explosion of music, dance and freedom, rooted in Caribbean culture and resilience. It is the Notting Hill Carnival, a celebration of identity, community, belonging. It's about heritage, and every August bank holiday, history spills onto the streets of West London. But the festival is complex. It does have a dark side. In recent years, serious violence has dominated the headlines. Young lives lost, destinies rewritten. In this episode, we explore the two sides of Carnival. The joy, the culture, but also the very real challenges that can no longer be ignored. Welcome to the Crime Agents. Hello and welcome back to the Crime Agents with me, crime journalist Andy Hughes.
And me, the ex-cop, Neil Basu.
Make sure you're following our feed on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And remember, you can watch our full episodes on YouTube as well.
And if you're not following us on socials already, we're at the Crime Agents on all major platforms.
So here we are. We're in the week of the Notting Hill Carnival. Have you ever been as a punter?
Well, I'm slightly ashamed to say, after living the vast majority of my adult life and working in London, I have never been as a punter.
Have you not?
I've been as a police officer.
I bet you have. Well, I have been as a punter a few times, and I tell you what, it's great. It's just during the day, the music, the sounds, the celebration, the joy. It is amazing. To be there.
I understand that because I've been there on the ground when that's been happening, and the trouble is, when you're there as a police officer, you're on high alert, you're hyper vigilant all the time.
Yeah.
And I think we've just done it, so I'm going to call ourselves out here, from playground to hunting ground.
Yeah.
That kind of media headline around Notting Hill Carnival, if you're a police officer, you're reading the same media everyone else is reading. I think we do end up seeing it through a completely different lens. I mean, wouldn't it be fantastic if... I've got friends who are Brazilian. They don't speak about the Rio Carnival in the way we speak in Britain about the Notting Hill Carnival.
Yeah.
Instead of being a source of national pride, it's a source of national headlines.
Well,
and that sits uncomfortably with
well,
me.
the problem is, though, when, you just have to look at the number of stabbings and violence that have happened in the previous years. These things have to be highlighted.
I know. I do sometimes worry with a sort of background in serious crime, including homicide and gangland crime, as well as counter-terrorism. Sometimes your risk threshold is way too high. And, it is right to say over the last 3 years there has been an increase. But I think we do need to talk about why that is the case.
Yeah.
And whether or not we're getting that out of perspective in some respects.
Yeah.
I don't think it isn't something that ought to be talked about at the highest level. So the fact that you've got governments, commissioners, Westminster City Hall, you've got everyone talking about, crime and safety and crowds. And I think we need to sort of distinguish where the real risk is coming from. Because for me, I think it's about crowds.
Yeah.
The crime statistics themselves, well, you've got 2 million people descending on London for 3 days. The crime levels... I'm not...
It's minute when you look at the actual percentage.
I hate to say that out loud because that is a cop's perspective who's seen an awful lot of terrible things in 30 years. I think for anybody who's living in London, reading what happens in the newspapers the day after, and Tuesday will be the acid test, the day after the carnival finishes, when you're rolling up the numbers, I think to most people they're quite shocked. And it's quite a shocking thing. It's not always that shocking to cops who deal with serious. What they don't want to be doing is dealing with that level over such a compressed time period when they're absolutely knackered in an environment that is incredibly dangerous to police.
Yeah, of course. Listen, we'll get into that later, but why don't we go back to when it started? So it was really, the birth of it was kind of after World War II, when thousands of Caribbean people moved to Britain as part of the Windrush generation. That many settled in West London, especially in Notting Hill. Life was tough. Racism was rife then. Housing conditions were poor and communities often faced lots of hostility. And it was 1958 when the Notting Hill race riots happened.
I know you and I are sort of music aficionados, and
We are.
we're kind of crime aficionados, and we talk about gangsters and stuff. There'll be lots of people listening to this who, of course, were not even a twinkle in their parents' eyes when all of this happened. But we're talking about Teddy Boys here, a sort of a gangster phenomenon coming out of rock and roll in the 50s, who wanted to get together. Flick knives was a big thing, fist fights, gang violence. It was a thing back then, but of course it was marred by the spectre of racism that was going through because of the Windrush Caribbean experience and the way they were treated. And a particular volatile flashpoint was West London between Notting Hill and Ladbroke Grove.
So how did it start then?
Well, the race riots themselves were largely because of the way the new wave of immigration. The Windrush generation was invited as British Commonwealth citizens to come and help rebuild Britain after the Second World War. There were all kinds of concerns in government about what that would do to community cohesion, and a lot of that. There's a brilliant paper, I may have mentioned it before on a podcast, called Black Skin, White Hall, which is a history of government policy and immigration going right back to this era and how it was being viewed in the country. And of course, this all goes straight up to 1968 and Enoch Powell and that famous Rivers of Blood speech and what that did to racism in the country. But in the meantime, the year after 1958, a man called Kelso Cochrane, and Kelso Cochrane came from my favourite Caribbean island, Antigua, and he was part of the Windrush generation. He was murdered in Notting Hill, and it was a result of that murder, which was a racially motivated killing. So, we in my era, we talk about Stephen Lawrence as being the most famous racist murder, and which changed the face of policing. Back in 1959, it was Kelso Cochrane, and 1,200 people attended his funeral in solidarity, and a brilliant activist on civil rights called Claudia Jones decided to organise a response to that, and she wanted a response that wasn't about racism and hate.
Right.
And she called it a Caribbean Carnival. It was in St Pancras Town Hall, and that effectively is the foundation of what has become the world's second biggest street party, Notting Hill Carnival.
Yeah, and it was in the 1960s that it moved to the streets, and that's when steel bands, that's when they started coming in. And in the 70s, it grew massively. It became a lot louder. There was a lot more people attending. But it was actually in the 90s that you actually saw it become this phenomenon. And it became the most famous street party in the world, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. We've talked about the 50s race riots, but of course this was a really, really difficult period for the United Kingdom as a whole, with deindustrialisation, 3-day week. Where we talk about all of these things today about cost of living crisis and how we're feeling, and austerity and immigration issues. But of course, back in the 70s, when I was a young boy growing up, shadow of the National Front, this was a massive problem. And 1958 to the mid-70s, again, music aficionados, my wife calls me president of music club at home, there is a very famous single by a very famous band called The Clash called White Riot, and it is based on the 1976 Notting Hill Carnival race riot.
Yeah.
So 58, 59 race riots in Notting Hill, 76, it's continuing. There is a long history here about antagonism between the black community, the post-Windrush Afro-Caribbean generation, and policing and over-policing in the 70s and 80s. So leading right up into the 90s, that tension and those kind of headlines has been there for pretty much as long as Notting Hill Carnival has existed.
Do you know what I found when I attended? I went during the day. Even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't have lasted into the night. But I did notice a total change in mood when the sun fell. And I referenced that in my opening. And you could just see, it was kind of, you felt like a stench of menace come out. And you saw people in balaclavas, and you saw a change in the police mood as well. During the day, of course, you see police officers. Police officers are dancing, and they're regularly filmed, and some have gone viral over the years. But there's a real change in mood, especially on the Sunday. So it's obviously a 3-day festival. So you got the Saturday, that usually is full of joy. Sunday, full of joy. That's the family day. But it's the Sunday evening, sun goes down and things start to change. So last year, there was 2 murders, and one of them, a lady called Cher Maximin, she was a totally innocent mother who found herself caught up in a group where violence broke out, and she was trying to protect her young daughter. And some guy, he got hold of a zombie knife, and when he swung back to attack someone, he caught her in the thigh, severed an artery, and she died tragically. Now, this has led to calls because usually in the past it has been gang on gang violence late on the Sunday and Monday. Not to mean that doesn't take away anything from those young lives, of course, but when a completely innocent young mother is caught up in violence, then mood shifts and people start calling for change.
I know. I mean, that's an incredibly heartbreaking example, and I know exactly what you're talking about because I used to be a homicide SIO on senior investigating officer on Operation Trident, and when it was, when it was perceived by the community of black gangsters killing black gangsters, no one was interested. It pretty much wouldn't make the papers. Collateral damage, and there's a very famous incident in Kensal Green, just around the corner from Notting Hill, back in 2003 that I dealt with, where a gangster called Tony Byfield was murdered, and his 7-year-old was murdered alongside him
you've
as a
spoken
witness.
about that before, haven't you?
Yeah, and that the collateral damage of a completely innocent young person getting killed in those circumstances, and a young mother like you've just described, absolutely is going to put the focus on front and safety about crime and safety at this event.
It changes things, doesn't it? Certainly in the public's eyes. I mean, let's just have a look at some of the violence that has happened. In the last 6 carnivals, there's been 62 stabbings, and there's been 3 fatalities since 2022. And I want to talk about that case in 2022. It was a young rapper called Takeo Nemard. He was from Bristol. He travelled up that day with his younger sister to enjoy the carnival with his mates. He was targeted by a group of young men. He was stabbed in his leg, severed an artery, and he died. And this was on the Monday evening. Now, this murder is still unsolved, but I spent the following week after his murder with his family. So I got in touch with his family 2 days after he was killed, and I asked to join them for the week. I just wanted to see through their eyes and tell the story of actually the human cost of this violence. So they invited me in, and the first time I met them, I went to the murder scene, and I'm feeling a bit kind of emotional about it now. And then I just remember seeing the mother, and she had tears in her eyes, and the dad was just like, you could tell he was still in shock. And when I spoke to them, I was kind of expecting a bit of anger from them, but it was the exact opposite. He just said, I just pray for peace. I pray for peace. Please, can all these kids just put down the knives? It was so powerful. And but they were hopeful that they would get justice. We're now 3 years on from that. And then the case now is, there's been 8 people arrested and still no charges. They've all been released. And I think one of the things that that really hits home for me is when I spoke to the parents recently, they said that they know who the murderers are and they see them quite often. And they told me that the murderers laugh at them in the street. I mean, it's not worth thinking about that.
I can understand why you got emotional. I'm sitting here as a very experienced murder squad cop getting quite emotional myself. I dealt with 17 murders of young black men in similar circumstances on Operation Trident. And in every single case, the heartbreak of the family is just... I mean, I'd ask them to hold on. I mean, I'd like to think that my murder squad colleagues... a murder is never closed. Whatever anyone ever says, an unsolved murder is never closed. It might not be even actively investigated, but if there's ever any another lead that comes, it will be investigated. And what I'd say, and particularly in cases like this, loyalties change.
Yeah.
My great mentor on Trident Murder Squads was a guy called Julian Heaton. And I remember when I started, I mean, this guy was dealing with 90 murders and attempted murders on his own, along with one colleague in the south of London. And he was, he just looked at me incredibly calmly and said, "Never give up.
Yeah.
Never give up. You just hold out. Loyalties will change. People will speak. People will eventually be horrified. People will want rid of this." And years later, he was proved absolutely.
Well, it's what they say,
and we started solving them.
It's what they say about cold cases, isn't it? There's 2 things that always change. It's people and science. But anyway, listen,
That's absolutely true.
because that was that murder It was the first murder in quite a number of years. And because he was quite a well-known rapper, it became headline news. It was just on the front page of every paper. And so I met up with one of the organisers of the carnival, and I asked her about this. And I said, how do you feel about this when something like this happens? And here's what she said.
It's hugely tragic, and I don't ever want to dismiss, the life that has been lost. He was going to be a father. There's a huge tragedy, but we are not a monolith. We are many things. And what happened to him happened after the masqueraders were pretty much done as well. This is not a reflection of who we are. Actually, what happened to him is the opposite of who we are.
Well, that's an incredibly moving thing to hear, but also, people's capacity for sort of forgiveness and moving on is sometimes a bit breathtaking. I'm not sure I could be like that. But there's a really important point here is not, it's very easy to make policy on the basis of individual incidents, and that we have got to be more perceptive than that. And we've got to, as you said, these things are happening when London almost turns into Gotham City from Batman. When the parties have gone and the music has gone and people are starting to target each other. I mean, my experience of policing that kind of underworld is that they'll be targeting each other anyway. It's just what Notting Hill is. It's a focal point. A lot of gangs know that their adversaries are going to be there. They're going to be on the ground. This is the difficult thing with... We had a real phenomenon in the 90s around nightclubs and major artists who were turning up and attracting a crowd because everybody supported them. Yeah. But it did mean that rival gangs were going to be in the same vicinity, quite often either fueled by alcohol or drugs and anxious to get their own back. It is a very toxic mix. Yeah. But would we change an entire carnival for 2 million people over 3 days on the basis of individual events? I don't think that's what we should be looking at. I think sometimes the crime statistics, particularly the most horrific of crimes, are used to advance that argument, where I don't think that's the real argument. It's the emotional one. But the real argument for me is about crowds and crushing and the potential for something to go horribly wrong, which is nothing to do with crime. Yeah. It's just to do with the sheer density of numbers and the difficulty of policing that. And I've got a pretty horrific story of my own around that.
Okay, let's leave that there. And after the break, we're going to be looking at why police call this an unpoliceable event. So let's look at the policing side of it. So I as you do, Neil, obviously, know many police officers. And when you mention Notting Hill Carnival to them, you kind of see them deflate. They say it's an absolute nightmare. I was speaking to one firearms officer very recently, in fact, and he's been assigned to this year, and he is not looking forward to put it mildly. He said to me that the most terrified he's ever been is policing this event late at night when the mood turns. Now, this is a firearms officer whose job it is to confront the most dangerous situations possible. But he says the Notting Hill Carnival, for him, is the most terrifying, which struck me. And I think what's interesting is that the policing of the Notting Hill Carnival starts months in advance in terms of the planning. But also on the ground, the gang units themselves, they will be, and I've been with them while they're doing this. They go around Notting Hill and the surrounding areas trying to pick up and arrest all the gang members and all the drug dealers. But they don't have much success in doing this, of course, because all the gang members always go to ground, and they tell me that's because they make so much money off the Notting Hill Carnival selling drugs. That it's just not worth it for them. So, I mean, I've heard quite a lot of them actually leave the country and go on holiday during August so that they're not in a police cell for when the festival starts. And also, a lot of gang rivalries are settled then. It's when quite a number of gangs in London all descend in the same place, which is very, very rare. How much of a nightmare is it for police?
It's very funny you saying about them going away on holiday, yeah. I mean, even I used to joke about terrorists and COVID. Even the terrorists were obeying the COVID laws because they were so frightened of COVID, so they weren't on the streets. And it was the same when I was on Trident about gangsters. They all wanted their summer holidays.
Yeah.
So you'd find them in the south of Spain. You'd find them in Ibiza.
Oh, they do. Yeah.
There's quite a few who went to Cyprus, particularly northern Cyprus, where there wasn't an extradition treaty.
Yeah.
So yes, they would go away. And I think we started that very aggressive, proactive policing tactic on the back of the Trident proactive squads, who dealt with sort of shootings and gun crime, and particularly a lot of the drug crime within the black community, where the black community were giving us a lot of the intelligence to enable us to go out and do those kind of proactive things. And it became very obvious that Notting Hill Carnival was becoming a kind of seller's hotspot. And therefore doing that work in the weeks leading up to Notting Hill Carnival might have a suppressive effect on that kind of violence. So I think that started around 2014, 2015. I thought we were quite slow on the uptake about that becoming a more aggressive strategy. But of course, the over-policing of the carnival is something that has caused lots of tension. We talked about that in the decades before.
Yeah.
And certainly the last few years, you've seen a big ramp up of stop and search, a huge increase in the number of people being turned over, almost 50% more in 2022, 23.
Yeah.
That also drives up, proactive policing drives up crime rates. So when we talk about the arrest rates gone up, and well, that's largely because we're deploying a lot more officers, and they're being much more proactive in what they do, not just in the weeks leading up, but in those 3 days as well. But the aim is a laudable one. The aim is to help the 1.99 million people who are going there to have a great time and stop the people who are trying to ruin it for everybody getting a foothold when the shadows come down, as you described it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to clarify why it is such a nightmare for police, and why that firearms officer I spoke to said it was the most terrifying job he ever goes on. It's because you don't know where the threat's coming from. It's because it's an unticketed event. People aren't scanned as they come in. Why is that not the case when we've seen violence? And so if you're a police officer, you're in the thick of things. Things are kicking off. You do not know where to look or focus your attention on. And for them, that is a very vulnerable position for a police officer to be in.
Absolutely. Police officers need to be like owls. You need that kind of 360-degree swivel on your head and eyes all about you, knowing where the next threat is coming from. You cannot do that if you're shoulder to shoulder in a crowd, either with your colleague or separated from your colleague by crowds that are effectively crushing you as well as each other. The sheer density of putting that many people in such a small area without all of those safeguards that you described, which are pretty much the norm for every event now. I mean, New Year's Eve, which is a big spectacle and created big crushing crowds, has become a ticketed spectacle.
It's a good point, that, actually.
Everyone was really concerned about that when that happened. Glastonbury's become a ticketed festival.
Yeah.
All of these things which created crowds which were unmanageable unless safeguards were brought in have changed. The one exception is Notting Hill.
It is. I wonder why that is. The thing is, security has been ramping up. There's all these barriers that the counter-terror police put in, to prevent terror attacks and what have you.
Well, that's mainly because, obviously the crowd is a focal point for
course
terrorists.
It is,
So
it's the number
those
one
things
target.
have to happen. But I wonder what that feels like to people who don't realise that, and whether they feel like this is an event that's now being over-policed. And I do wonder, the organising committee and the charitable trust that help run it, I wonder if they feel, because of the history of the carnival and the sort of tension between the state and the police and the event itself and where it comes from, whether they don't want to be told how to do it. But I was really interested in June. There was a leaked letter from one of the organising committee members to Lisa Nandy, the Secretary of State for Department of Culture, Media and Sport, effectively saying, unless you give us money, central government, there could be a disaster at Notting Hill. So effectively pointing out exactly what we're describing, how difficult this place is to steward effectively. And if it's difficult to steward effectively because they don't have enough stewards, then it is impossible to police. And that police officer, not just any police officer, but a police officer with a firearm. I've been Bronze Firearms Commander for Notting Hill, so my job was to decide based on firearms intelligence how you resolve that intelligence. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean sending heavily armed police officers into a crowd where they could easily be separated, easily have their own guns taken from them? I mean, there's a basic rule of firearms and public order is you don't put firearms into the middle of a public order situation.
Well,
and of course, on that Monday, there is a history of Notting Hill becoming not a community event, but a public order situation.
Yeah.
No wonder that firearms officer's terrified.
Well, I think one of the major concerns now is, again, police officers have been telling me, is that it's a matter of time before, a Hillsborough-style crushing event happens. And that's what the leader of Conservatives City Hall, Susan Hall, has been saying. She's saying that actually it's the crowds that is the big safety issue, and how do you resolve this?
Well, it doesn't sound like it's just Susan Hall saying that. It sounds like the organising committee as well.
And the police.
Definitely the commissioner, and it's definitely the Police Federation, who've been arguing on behalf of their members for years that this is too dangerous for their officers. They're not only getting assaulted in all kinds of different ways, some of it friendlier than others, if you know what I mean, but still something that's uninvited.
Yeah, there has been a few of those.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of the kind of indecent assault of a police officer on duty.
Yeah.
But there's also been some very serious injuries to police officers, both in public order and when they get isolated.
Yeah.
Probably one of the worst things I have ever dealt with as a cop was what used to be called deaths in custody. So back in 2002, I was a senior investigating officer in professional standards investigating what were called deaths in custody. So if somebody died at the hands of the police after we'd arrested them, there had to be a professional investigation, almost the same kind of level of investigation as a homicide, because you had to prove or disprove that the police had had anything to do with this. It's one of the most difficult and emotional and potentially dangerous investigations to deal with, depending on the ethnicity of the person who's died. And when that person is black, it becomes incredibly emotional. And I remember getting a call from my boss saying he'd just taken a call from the borough commander of Kensington and Chelsea. And of course, Notting Hill Carnival was on the borough of Kensington and Chelsea's footprint, saying they've just had a death at the carnival and you need to investigate it and you need to find out what happened. You need to find out quick. I said, what do you mean, find out quick? And they were worried that the death of this young girl at the carnival would be seen as a flashpoint for a potential riot. And I had to ask why. They hadn't kind of explained to me what had happened. And what had happened is she'd had a severe asthma attack, and she'd died from this asthma attack. But while she was suffering from the asthma attack, they couldn't get an ambulance to her. The police couldn't get to her. You couldn't get any vehicles anywhere near her. She was effectively in the back garden of a house, which was totally surrounded by tens of thousands of people. The effect of this was lack of emergency services. In the end, a serial of territorial support group officers went to her on foot and then tried to give her CPR.
Yeah.
The crowds that were there saw that as police officers leaning over a young woman. They thought the police officers were assaulting that woman and killing her. So I'm not going to go into a description of, I've been to dozens of postmortems. This was the worst one I've ever been to in my life. This incredibly vivacious young teenage girl who just had months living with her family, visiting her family in Africa, and was coming back to London where she was born in order to study, has this asthma attack, dies, and then becomes a focal point for potentially a riot in Notting Hill Carnival, which she had gone to as an experience she'd been waiting for her whole life. And her aunt was with me at the funeral, the aunt that she had spent time out in Africa with, and collapsed in my arms when she saw her daughter lying there. It was just horrific. And of course, the post-mortem proved that she had died of a severe asthma attack, not of assault. Trying to get the family and the community to understand that that's what had happened became a pivotal moment in Notting Hill Carnival history. But for me, the horror of it was, we can't save people as we would normally want to save people because we can't get to them in time. Yeah,
well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's, and we have to keep saying this, 99.9% of the people there are there for a joyous occasion. But there are, it certainly changes as the evening goes on, the sun goes down. But it's important that people hear these stories, I think. It's important that people hear the reality of actually the safety concerns and what can happen at this chaotic event.
And it seems to me that everybody is now worried about it and everyone is talking about it, but no one is. The solutions that have been proposed have been very unpopular with the committee. So moving it to a much larger area like Hyde Park, which is open and can the way of managing the crowds could be much more easily done, is seen as destroying the nature of Notting Hill and what it was all about. And of course, it does sort of change the name, doesn't it, when it's not in Notting Hill anymore. But what's more important is to preserve the kind of the history and the tradition and the music and the festivity,
absolutely,
but actually make it safe and easier to police.
Yeah,
I mean, it's 7,000 police officers a day.
yeah.
The cost of this, somebody was telling me the cost, I don't know whether your sources have told you, I think last year was 13.5 million quid.
Sure.
I mean, I think that's pretty much the same as policing the Premier League in London for the entire season. In 3 days. Wow. And a friend of mine was telling me his annual leave for Notting Hill, he's nothing to do with Notting Hill, but his annual leave as a police officer in London was cancelled months ago and is not released. In other words, he's not entitled to apply for leave until they've fixed all the shifts within a few weeks of Notting Hill, which is in the middle of the summer season. If you've got a family and you're trying to plan your life, no wonder it's so unpopular with police officers. I mean, most of them are not volunteers for the carnival, even though it's bank holiday and double time.
And also why, like you, none of them go in their spare time. So let's take a break there. And after this, we're going to be hearing about the future of the carnival and why global superstar Stormzy got into a Twitter spat with the Met about the Notting Hill Carnival. Neil, how are the authorities and the organisers going to make this event more safe? But I know there's talk of moving it to a big park, Hyde Park, or wherever it may be. I'm not sure. Well, I know that will not go down well, because the whole point of this is it's the most famous street festival in the world.
Yeah.
Well, it's not going to be in the street anymore. How is that going to work?
Yeah, it'd like be moving Rio to Sao Paulo.
Exactly.
It's not going to work.
Yeah, exactly.
So I understand why there's such a pushback against it, but there are not many places. Even the Rio Festival is over a much wider footprint.
Yeah.
So it's a similar number of people, 2 million over a short period of time, over a much wider footprint. My real concern is that it will take a disaster, a crushing disaster, another Hillsborough, before people actually go, well, that's it. And we're almost waiting for that disaster.
Well, the warnings are there.
Yeah, because what we want, I've said it right at the start of this, I want this to be a symbol of national pride. I want people to want to come to, and they do come to this country to go to Notting Hill Carnival, because it should be a source of national pride.
Well, yeah,
and,
it is,
and if the
it
headlines,
is amazing.
if the headlines continue to be about crime and the crush and police officers saying, I can't police this, it's unpoliceable, that is a nightmare for the country, and it is a nightmare for the opposition. But there are lots of safety measures. You've talked about some of them. The ticketing of an event, the better stewarding of the event, which requires more money. So there does need to be some resourcing of this event. And who is putting the money in? I don't know. A combination of sponsors, central government, people who are coordinating the event need to raise more money to get more professional stewarding. That would help.
I don't
help the police.
I really don't know why this isn't ticketed. I mean, you look at other street events like the New Year's Eve and what have you, and where people are scanned as they go.
I know it would make a massive difference.
And of course, it would make a massive difference in terms of crowds, but also in terms of safety of people, in terms of bringing weapons in and what have you.
Yeah,
it would make a big. Can you explain to me why that's not happening?
No, other than I think the long history of the carnival being over-policed and causing problems in the past. I think that is still, there's a hangover to the policing of the event.
The world changes though, Neil.
Yeah, but it's interesting to see the last few years under Mark Rowley, the increase in stop and search, the increase in really proactive measures. And of course, what he's trying to do is make this safe for, as we've said, the 99.9% people who are there to enjoy the music and have a good time. So that's got to be celebrated. And one of the things that he's bringing back, which was trialled back in 2016, is live facial recognition. Now this causes. What do you think of live?
Well,
facial
do you know what
recognition?
I was just about to say? I've reported on this for years. I still don't have the foggiest what it is and how it works, and if it's actually any accurate. Is it?
Yes, it is.
Oh yeah.
So the trouble is, when
you would say that, wouldn't you?
I would say that. I mean, when I was head of
I'm not so
counter-terrorism, I did not understand why we had not taken live facial recognition technology and tested it at our grade A ports. When I say grade A ports, I mean our biggest ports, biggest high threat points of border security, where Heathrow Airport being a great example, all the major airports, all the major maritime ports where people are coming in and represent a potential national security risk. I do not think the public I think I could have stood up with the director of Liberty and said, I'm doing this because we're under major terrorist threat.
Liberty, of course.
Liberty being a civil rights group who along with people like Big Brother Watch, who think that we want an entirely surveillance society. But if I was telling them, well, it's to stop the most dangerous people in society getting into the country, I think that would have been a difficult thing. But we didn't do that.
Yeah.
We stuck it in a van in South Wales when it wasn't very accurate, where it was giving loads of false positives. So basically a camera trained on your face. Andy, you look a little bit like Mr. Biggs, who's a major criminal from an organised criminal network. It's going to tell you it's Mr. Biggs, and your police officer's going to come and arrest you, drag you down to a police station, take your fingerprints and your DNA, and eventually find out that you're not Mr. Biggs at all, but not before you've been arrested and humiliated. Yeah. You couldn't have that kind of false positive, and it was even worse if you were a woman or an ethnic minority. Yeah. The number of false positives was even greater. That is not the case anymore. It's almost 9 years since that initial
shambles
pilot happened, and but that shambles lives long in the memory, and now people
well,
go,
it does,
God. But now effectively what you've got is a database of serious criminals, and you've got cameras that are being trained on individual faces as they go through a public place. Now, I don't care about that. When a camera, I wouldn't mind if you were scanning me against every government database there is, because you'd find out I have a driving licence and a passport, and by the way, I'm a really upstanding member of society. Why would I care about that? But if I'm a criminal, a gangster,
you would care
a
about
known
it.
drug dealer, you'd really
Do you
care
know what
about
I
it.
always
might
find?
Not go. It might be a really good suppression tactic.
People have a lot of views on, the amount of CCTV and live facial recognition and what have you. I'll tell you what, those views change when you become a victim of a crime.
They do.
And then,
or if you're head of counter-terrorism.
Well, yeah, or you're a cop, yeah. No, but if you're not doing anything wrong, then what's the problem?
No, I understand. And I understand that the criminal justice system makes mistakes. And that was the big criticism of this. But it is much more, it's been proven by national independent laboratories, nothing to do with the police. The technology has improved beyond all recognition. And we know that's happening quicker and quicker. Tomorrow there'll be new technology, Andy, we've never heard of, which will be absolutely incredible. It has got to a point where now it is to not have that as a crime fighting tool would be a massive lapse in responsibility of any chief constable in the country, in my view.
People are saying in the media that the Notting Hill Carnival should be more like Glastonbury. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't know what that means, but of course Glastonbury has a lot of the safeguards we've just said. It is a music festival in the middle of a massive field, basically, so it doesn't have the crushing problems that this has. It has per capita. See, this is where statistics can be really dangerous. People compare Notting Hill Carnival with Glastonbury. Glastonbury has about a tenth of the number of people. It's now ticketed and stewarded, and it has about a tenth of the number of arrests.
I think it's an absurd argument, to be honest.
Yeah, you're not comparing like with like. It's apples with pears, really. I mean, the vast majority of the arrests there are for drugs, but it's a happier event, and you're not in the middle of a major capital city when the lights go down. So, but they still have arrests, they still have drug dealing, but it's much easier to police, and all of those things are safer for the people who are attending and safer for the people who have to police it. Much more interesting to compare it with Rio, and then you see crime rates pretty much the same. Rio de Janeiro is not as safe a city as London. All of those kind of things worth comparing with. But I remember, I don't know, I didn't find it very amusing at the time, for one reason, and this is the big fallout that we had with the goal commander for Notting Hill Carnival and Stormzy.
What?
When Stormzy was back in 2017, Stormzy was probably pretty much the biggest artist on the planet at the time.
But still not.
And I was about, my head of communications in counter-terrorism had managed to get him to agree to come and do a campaign for us, and the campaign was called Run, Hide, Tell, and it was what to do if you were caught up in a terrorist attack.
Right.
And we were going to have Stormzy leading this campaign.
Really?
It would have been viral. It would have been amazing. At the same time, it was just before Notting Hill Carnival, and he criticised the policing of Notting Hill Carnival, saying, the goal commander had just put out the amount of proactive, how many doors they kicked in, how many they'd just seized a kilo of heroin up the road, and he'd basically said that was destined for Notting Hill Carnival without any evidence that it was. But he was trying to make a point. He was trying to make a dramatic point, saying, if you're a drug dealer, stay away from Notting Hill because look, we're arresting you and getting you. Of course,
dangerous game to play. That
it was
though,
a
isn't
dangerous game to play when you've got one of the biggest viral superstars on the planet who's got a Twitter following slightly more than the goal commander.
Well,
of
he
Notting Hill
went
Carnival,
to Twitter, did
who
he?
said, "I'll be interested in how many doors you're kicking in before Glastonbury next
Oh!
year." So he compared the two things directly. And of course, the next call my director of comms got was, "I don't think Stormzy will be doing your campaign this year." And then a week later, Anthony Joshua, who was also lined up for the campaign,
Really?
has to drop out as well. And I thought, God,
Was it because of that as
he's
well?
a mate of Stormzy. No, he was about to fight Vladimir Klitschko. You know what a boxing fan I am.
Yeah.
So anyone who's never seen that is one of the greatest British world heavyweight moments in history. That fight was amazing, but his manager would not let him get into the ring, having just done a campaign called Run, Hide, Tell. And I couldn't really blame him for that.
That is brilliant.
But I did. I was thinking, God, if the goal commander for Notting Hill that year had just kept his tweet shut, I would have been. It would have been much better for my campaign. But again, it's the ridiculous comparison of apples and pears.
Yeah.
Compare Notting Hill to Rio.
Yeah.
And I guess the bottom line for this whole argument is Notting Hill Carnival, yes or no. And my point is yes.
Well, it's a yes from me. Yeah.
Yeah, it
absolutely.
should be a source of national pride. Should it be moved? Yes or no? What's your view?
No.
Well, that's interesting.
I don't think it can be moved. You would lose the very essence and the soul of the whole thing. It can't be moved.
Yeah. So my head as a police officer and the head of the Police Federation will be very pleased to hear me say this is yes, it must be, because it's no longer safe. And that for me is not about crime. It's about crowds and crushing. But my heart is with you and says, no, you can't, because you'll rip the heart out of what should be one of the world's great celebrations.
Even my head says no, because there are ways to make it safer. So, I mean, we've talked about them. Ticketing, barriers, scanners as people walk in, which controls the crowd better. I mean, this can be done. This is not an impossibility. It's just going to take time and money, which I'm guessing is the problem.
I think that is the problem. I think we're making an appeal for all of those organisers here to get together and cure this problem.
Yeah.
And you might be able to get away from the constant arguments of why isn't it in Hyde Park if you do what you're suggesting. And I think that leaked letter to Lisa Nandy, that tells me something. The government's listening, the commissioner's listening, the organising committee's listening, the head of Westminster Council's listening.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
Let's somebody has got to.
Let's all get on the same page here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that this can continue.
Well, listen, if you're going this weekend, I hope you have an amazing time. It is an amazing event. Let's be clear about that. And please, God, no violence.
Here.
Thanks so much for listening to The Crime Agents. Make sure you've subscribed on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode.
We'll be back with another main episode next week, and we'll have another Q&A episode for you soon. Remember, if you've got questions you'd like us to answer, you can send them by email to thecrimeagents@global.com or follow us on social media. We're at The Crime Agents on all major platforms, and you can leave a question there.
Well, that's it. Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.